Blood ties mean nothing when ambition takes the wheel. Hear the tale of a quiet woman who stared down her alpha, accepted his brutal public rejection without shedding a single tear, and unknowingly summoned a beast far worse. This is what happens when the Alpha King finally snaps. The great stone hall of Iron Fang Keep was suffocatingly warm, thick with the scent of roasted venison, spiced mead, and the nervous sweat of 300 werewolves. It was the night of the frost moon, the sacred medieval tradition where the goddess was said to pair the unmatched wolves of the pack. Torches flickered against the cold, damp walls, casting long, monstrous shadows across the tapestries that depicted the pack's bloody, victorious history. Standing near the back, half hidden by a massive oak pillar, was Genevieve Croft. Genevieve was not royalty. She was the daughter of the late pack scribe, a woman who spent more time with ink-stained fingers and dusty leather-bound ledgers than she did training in the sparring rings. In a pack that valued brute strength and battle scars, Genevieve was virtually invisible, and she preferred it that way. She had hoped to slip through the frost moon ceremony unnoticed, return to her small cottage near the eastern wall, and continue her quiet, solitary life. But fate, it seemed, had a cruel sense of humor. The shift in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous. It started as a prickle at the base of Genevieve's neck, a sudden magnetic pull that made her heart slam against her ribs. The air grew heavy, smelling sharply of crushed pine needles and fresh snowfall. Her wolf, usually a quiet presence in the back of her mind, suddenly clawed at her consciousness, howling a single, terrifying word. Mate. Genevieve gasped, her hands gripping the rough bark of the oak pillar to keep her knees from buckling. She looked up, her gaze dragged by an invisible, undeniable force toward the raised dais at the front of the hall. Standing there was Kaelin Cross, the newly ascended alpha of the Iron Fang pack. Kaelin was a vision of ruthless medieval nobility. Broad-shouldered, draped in a heavy cloak of black bear fur over a tunic of deep crimson, he possessed a sharp, aristocratic face that commanded fear and obedience. He had taken over the pack after his father's demise in the border skirmishes, and he was known for his cold, calculating ambition. And right now, Kaelin was staring directly at Genevieve. The chatter in the great hall died away. The pack members, sensing the sudden spike of potent mating pheromones, parted like the Red Sea, creating a clear, unobstructed path between the alpha and the lowly scribe's daughter. Whispers broke out, sharp and hissing. Her? Genevieve Croft? The alpha's mate is a scribe. She has no warrior blood. She's too weak to be Luna. Genevieve forced her trembling legs to move. The mate bond demanded it. Every step toward the dais felt like walking through waist-deep water. When she finally reached the bottom of the steps, she looked up at Kaelin, her chest heaving. She expected to see relief, or perhaps the fierce possessiveness that accompanied the discovery of a fated mate. Instead, she saw absolute, undisguised disgust. Kaelin's jaw was locked tight. He looked from Genevieve's simple, unadorned wool dress to the wealthy, politically powerful daughter of the neighboring River Run pack, Lady Arabella, who stood nearby, dripping in silver and silk. Kaelin's political ambitions were well known. He needed a strong alliance to secure the southern borders. He needed wealth, armies, and a Luna who could strike terror into the hearts of their enemies. Genevieve offered none of those things. Kaelin stepped forward, his boots ringing loudly against the stone floor. He didn't lower his voice for a private conversation. He wanted the entire pack to hear. "I, Kaelin Cross," he began, his voice booming over the gathered crowd, dripping with cold authority. "Alpha of the Iron Fang pack, reject you, Genevieve Croft, as my fated mate and Luna." The words struck Genevieve like a physical blow. The mate bond, a fragile, newly formed thread of pure, glowing energy connecting their souls, suddenly violently snapped. The pain was agonizing. It felt as though a hot iron had been plunged into her chest, carving out her heart, and leaving a hollow, bleeding cavity behind. Genevieve stumbled back a step, a sharp gasp tearing from her lips. In werewolf lore, a rejected mate usually collapsed. They screamed, they begged, they groveled. The pain of a severed bond often drove wolves mad, forcing them onto their knees to plead with their alpha to reconsider. The great hall waited with bated breath for the scribe's daughter to break. Lady Arabella smirked behind her goblet of wine. Elder Harrison, an old friend of Genevieve's father, looked away, unable to bear the sight of the girl's humiliation. Genevieve closed her eyes. The pain was a living fire in her veins. Her inner wolf whimpered, curling into a tight, miserable ball of agony. But as Genevieve dug her fingernails into her palms, drawing blood, a strange, profound clarity washed over her. She saw Cailan for what he was, a coward hiding behind ambition. If he was willing to cast away the goddess's decree for a political alliance, he was not a man worthy of her tears. He was not a king. He was a merchant, trading his soul for a few extra soldiers. Genevieve opened her eyes. The tears that had threatened to spill were gone, replaced by a cold, hard frost. She straightened her spine, pulling her modest wool shawl tighter around her shoulders. She looked Cailan dead in the eyes, her gaze unflinching. "I, Genevieve Croft," she said, her voice crystal clear, carrying flawlessly through the absolute silence of the vast hall. "Accept your rejection, Alpha Cailan." No screaming, no begging, no collapse. Just a calm, dignified severing of the tie. The moment she spoke the words, the agonizing pain in her chest dulled to a cold, heavy ache. The connection was gone. Cailan was nothing to her now, but a stranger in a fur cloak. The silence that followed was deafening. It was heavier than the stone blocks of the keep. 300 wolves stood paralyzed, staring at Genevieve in shock. An alpha's rejection was an execution of the soul. The victim was not supposed to stand tall and accept the axe with grace. Cailan himself looked momentarily stunned, his arrogance faltering as Genevieve simply turned her back on him. Without waiting for dismissal, Genevieve walked down the center aisle of the great hall. The crowd shrank away from her, as if she were made of fire. She pushed open the heavy oak doors, stepping out into the freezing, biting wind of the medieval winter, leaving the suffocating silence of Ironfang Keep behind her. The law of the Pax was unforgiving. An accepted rejection was a mutual severing of ties, meaning Genevieve was no longer bound to the Alpha, and by extension, no longer truly belonged to the Pack. While she wasn't officially exiled, staying meant living as an outcast, a constant, uncomfortable reminder of the Alpha's defiance of the goddess. 3 days had passed since the Frost Moon ceremony. For 3 days, Genevieve had locked herself in her stone cottage, packing her meager belongings into a single woven sack. She had her father's ledgers, a few changes of woolen clothes, a pouch of dried herbs, and a handful of silver coins. She planned to leave at first light, heading toward the neutral trading villages of the Free Valleys, where a scribe might find work. The winter wind howled outside her window, rattling the wooden shutters. Genevieve was tying the final knot on her sack when a sound tore through the crisp morning air, vibrating through the very foundation of her cottage. It was a war horn, deep, guttural, and resonant. Genevieve froze. It wasn't the jagged alarm call of a rogue attack. It was a royal procession call. She opened her door, stepping out into the snow-covered lane. Panic was already sweeping through the courtyard of Ironfang Keep. Villagers and warriors alike were scrambling, dropping their blacksmith hammers and baskets of kindling. Riding through the heavy iron gates of the keep was a contingent of wolves that made Cailan's warriors look like untrained pups. They rode massive armored war horses their dark cloaks lined with the silver-tipped fur of the northern mountains, and at the center of the vanguard, riding a destrier as black as pitch, was Silas Montgomery, the Alpha King. The air in the keep instantly grew suffocatingly dense. Silas Montgomery was a living legend, a warlord who had united the fractured territories of the continent a decade ago through a campaign of sheer, unadulterated brutality. He was rarely seen outside his mountain fortress, the High Seat. He ruled with a terrifying, absolute authority. Rumors said he had no mate, no heir, and no mercy. He was a creature of war, not politics. Genevieve watched from the shadows of her doorway as Calen Cross rushed out of the main keep, looking thoroughly panicked. His crimson tunic was half-buttoned, his beta, Corwin, frantically whispering in his ear. Calen bowed low as King Silas brought his horse to a halt. Silas dismounted. He was terrifyingly tall, built like a fortress of muscle and scars. He wore dark leather armor, a broad sword strapped to his back, and his eyes, a striking glacial blue, swept over the courtyard with cold indifference. He had come, unannounced, to collect the winter tithe and inspect the southern borders. "My king," Calen stammered, his usual arrogance entirely evaporated. "We did not expect you. Iron Fang Keep is yours. A feast will be prepared immediately." Silas barely nodded, stalking past the bowing Alpha without a word, his royal guard flanking him like shadows. Genevieve stepped back inside, her heart hammering. The presence of the king meant the borders would be locked down. No one could leave the territory while the king was inspecting it. Her departure was delayed. Worse, Calen's beta, Corwin, was soon marching through the village, barking orders that every able-bodied woman was to report to the kitchens to help prepare the king's banquet. Genevieve, despite her outcast status, was no exception. That evening the great hall was transformed. The torches burned brighter, the finest silver goblets were brought out from the vaults, and the tables groaned under the weight of roasted boars, pheasants, and winter root vegetables. Genevieve, wearing her simple grey wool dress and a stained apron, was tasked with carrying heavy pitchers of spiced wine from the cellars to the high tables. She kept her head down, staying to the shadows near the tapestries, desperately avoiding Calen's glaring eyes. The Alpha was seated next to King Silas at the head table, desperately trying to engage the monarch in conversation about border treaties and troop numbers. King Silas looked utterly bored. He sat slouched in the high-backed wooden chair, an untouched goblet of wine in his hand. His glacial eyes stared blankly ahead, his jaw tight. He looked like a caged predator, vibrating with a dark, restless energy that made the hairs on the back of Genevieve's neck stand up. Genevieve hoisted a pitcher of wine, moving quietly behind the head table to refill the cup of one of the king's towering guards. Then it happened. The heavy oak doors of the kitchens swung open, catching a gust of wind from the upper parapets. The draught swept through the hall, lifting the heavy scent of roasted meat and spices and carrying it directly across the dais. It carried Genevieve's scent. To a normal wolf, Genevieve smelled like old parchment, dried lavender, and rain. But the moment the draught hit Silas Montgomery, the Alpha King completely froze. The bored, indifferent warlord vanished. Silas's spine snapped straight, his massive hands gripping the arms of his wooden chair with such sudden, terrifying force that the thick oak audibly splintered. Crack! The sound was sharp in the noisy hall. Calen stopped mid-sentence, looking at the king in alarm. "My king! Is something amiss?" Silas didn't answer. He was breathing heavily, his chest expanding as he drew in long, ragged lungfuls of air. He was tracking the scent. Slowly, terrifyingly, Silas turned his head. Genevieve froze mid-pour, the pitcher of wine trembling in her hands. She was standing barely 10 feet behind him. Silas's glacial blue eyes locked onto her. But they weren't blue anymore. They were bleeding into a brilliant, luminescent, terrifying alpha crimson. A low, guttural growl began to rumble in the king's chest. It was a sound so deep, so primal, that it rattled the silverware on the tables. The royal guards instantly dropped their food, their hands flying to the hilts of their swords, looking for the threat. The entire great hall plunged into a terrified, breathless silence. "Mine," Silas whispered. The word was a raspy, feral command that sent a shockwave of raw, unadulterated power through the room. Cailan turned, following the king's gaze, and his face drained of all color. He saw Genevieve, the girl he had publicly humiliated and discarded just 3 days prior. Silas stood up. He didn't just stand. He moved with the explosive speed of a striking viper. He kicked his heavy wooden chair back, the piece of furniture shattering against the stone wall. He ignored Cailan. He ignored his screaming guards. The king had completely lost control of his humanity. His inner beast had taken the wheel. Genevieve backed away, dropping the silver pitcher. It hit the floor with a loud clang, red wine splashing over her boots like blood. Silas stalked toward her, his crimson eyes burning a hole through her soul. He wasn't looking at a lowly scribe. He was looking at his crown, his salvation, his fated mate. And as the towering, monstrous king cornered her against the cold stone wall, his massive hands coming up to gently, reverently cup her terrified face, Genevieve realized her quiet life was officially over. The great hall of Iron Fang Keep was trapped in a suffocating, terrifying stillness. The only sound was the crackle of the hearth fires and the heavy, ragged breathing of the Alpha King. Silas Montgomery loomed over Genevieve Croft. His massive frame completely eclipsed the torchlight, plunging her into his shadow. Up close, the king was not just a warlord. He was a force of nature. The scent of him, ozone, crushed midnight pine, and the visceral, iron-tinged smell of a predator, wrapped around her like a heavy, protective blanket. When his calloused, battle-scarred hands gently framed her jaw, Genevieve flinched, expecting the same disgust she had seen in Cailan's eyes. But Silas's touch was impossibly reverent. His thumbs brushed over her cheekbones, his crimson eyes tracing every line of her pale face as if she were a holy relic he had spent a lifetime searching for. Suddenly, a golden warmth ignited deep within Genevieve's chest. It was nothing like the fragile, painful thread she had felt with Cailan. This bond was a roaring inferno, an ancient, unbreakable cable of pure, sovereign energy that anchored her soul directly to his. Her inner wolf, previously curled in a ball of agonizing misery, suddenly stood tall, letting out a joyous, triumphant howl that echoed in the deepest chambers of her mind. But as Silas leaned in, his nose grazing her jawline to inhale her scent, the king abruptly stiffened. The feral, possessive warmth in his eyes flickered, replaced by a storm of unadulterated fury. His upper lip curled back, bearing elongated, lethal canines. He had caught the scent beneath her natural fragrance of parchment and lavender. He smelled the bitter, lingering ash of a broken mate bond. He smelled the fresh, invisible scars on her soul. Silas slowly turned his head, looking over his shoulder at the high table. His eyes locked onto Cailan. "Who?" Silas rumbled, his voice dropping to a register so deep it vibrated through the stone floorboards. "Dared to break my queen?" The title sent a shockwave through the room. Queen. The collective gasp from the 300 wolves in the hall was audible. Lady Arabella's goblet slipped from her fingers, shattering against the stone floor, the red wine pooling like blood. Cailan Cross, the proud, ambitious alpha of Iron Fang, looked as though he had been struck by lightning. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The sheer, oppressive weight of the king's alpha aura was pressing down on the room, forcing weaker wolves to their knees. Cailan's legs trembled. "I asked a question," Silas roared, the sound ripping through the hall like a thunderclap. He stepped away from Genevieve, placing himself firmly in front of her, shielding her with his massive body. I smell the rotting ash of a severed bond on her skin. It is fresh. Who touched what is mine? Beta Corwin, terrified out of his wits, fell to his knees. "My king," he stammered, his forehead touching the cold stone. It was the Frost Moon ceremony. 3 days ago. Alpha Kalen. Silas didn't need to hear the rest. In a blur of motion, too fast for the human eye to track, the king crossed the distance between the floor and the dais. Before Kalen could even raise a hand in defense, Silas's hand shot out, wrapping around the Iron Fang Alpha's throat. With a sickening crunch, Silas lifted Kalen off the ground single-handedly. Kalen choked, his hands scrabbling uselessly at the king's iron grip. "You rejected her?" Silas whispered, his voice dangerously soft now, a deadly calm settling over his monstrous features. "You looked at the goddess's ultimate gift, the true Luna of the high seat, and you deemed her unworthy." She is a peasant," Kalen choked out, his face turning a mottled purple, desperately trying to justify his monumental mistake. "A scribe's daughter. Not fit for an alpha." Silas's eyes blazed with a terrifying, blinding crimson. "She is worth 1,000 of you." The king threw Kalen aside like a broken rag doll. Kalen crashed into the high table, splintering the heavy oak and sending roasted boars and silver platters crashing to the floor in a chaotic din. Silas drew his broadsword. The rasp of steel against leather sent a fresh wave of terror through the hall. He meant to execute the Alpha right then and there. "My king, wait!" The voice belonged to Elder Harrison, who rushed forward, throwing his frail body between the king and the bleeding Alpha. "I beg of you, hold your blade. By the ancient decrees, the treaties penned by Lord William Hastings in the First Era, a king cannot execute an Alpha in his own hall without a tribunal. It will spark a civil war among the southern packs." Silas paused, the tip of his broadsword resting an inch from Kalen's throat. He knew the name Lord William Hastings well. It was a real, binding historical treaty that kept the fragile peace between the savage werewolf territories. Silas could slaughter them all, but he was a king, not a butcher. He needed the southern borders secure. Silas slowly sheathed his sword, but his gaze remained lethal. "There will be no civil war," Silas spat, looking down at Kalen with absolute disgust. "Because Iron Fang no longer has an Alpha, you are stripped of your title, Kalen Cross. You will live the rest of your pathetic days, knowing you threw away the most powerful woman in our world for a cheap political parlor trick." Silas turned his back on the ruined man. He walked back to Genevieve, who was trembling by the wall. The anger melted from his face, replaced once again by that terrifying, overwhelming reverence. Without a word, he scooped her up into his arms. She weighed nothing to him. "Pack your ledgers, little bird," Silas murmured against her hair, his voice gentle. "We leave for the high seat at dawn. You will never set foot in this miserable keep again." The king commandeered the lord's chambers in the highest tower of Iron Fang Keep for the night. The blizzard howling outside had rendered the mountain passes unnavigable until morning. Silas had placed 2 of his most lethal royal guards outside the heavy oak door, refusing to let Genevieve out of his sight. Inside the chamber, a massive fire roared in the hearth. Genevieve sat on the edge of the velvet-draped canopy bed, her hands wrapped around a goblet of warm, spiced cider Silas had forced upon her to stop her shivering. The king paced the room like a caged panther, his eyes darting to the windows, his protective instincts in overdrive. "I don't understand," Genevieve finally whispered, breaking the heavy silence. She looked down at her plain, ink-stained hands. "Why me? The goddess paired me with Kalen first. It was a mistake. I am just Genevieve Croft. My father was a scribe." Silas stopped pacing. He knelt before her, entirely uncaring of the dirt on the floor, and took her small hands in his massive ones. The goddess does not make mistakes, Genevieve. Cailan was a test, a crucible. The goddess needed to sever you from Iron Fang's weak bloodline so you could be free to accept mine. You were never meant to be a minor Luna. You were born to be a queen. Genevieve shook her head, pulling away slightly. You don't know my bloodline. I have nothing to offer a king. Determined to prove her point, Genevieve reached for the woven sack she had brought with her. She pulled out the heavy, iron-clasped ledger her father had given her on his deathbed. He had made her swear never to open the final pages until she had left Iron Fang territory. Look, she said, flipping past the years of mundane grain tallies and tax records. She reached the back of the book. The parchment here was older, yellowed, and sealed with brittle red wax bearing a crest she didn't recognize, a crescent moon pierced by a silver sword. Silas's breath hitched the moment he saw the crest. Where did you get that? It's my father's, Genevieve said, breaking the ancient wax seal. She unrolled the parchment. It was a birth record, written in her father's meticulous handwriting, but the names were wrong. Child, Genevieve. Mother, Lady Eleanor Talbot. Father, Lord Henry Beaufort of the Silver Crest lineage. Genevieve stared at the names, her heart stopping. The names weren't just nobility. They were history. The Silvercrest Pack was the ancient royal bloodline of the Free Valleys, slaughtered 30 years ago by rogue armies. Lady Eleanor Talbot was the last known survivor, rumoured to have vanished into the southern mountains. My mother, Genevieve breathed, the world tilting on its axis. My mother wasn't a village woman. She was a Talbot. Silas let out a low, rumbling laugh of pure disbelief and awe. A scribe's daughter, he mocked gently, his eyes shining with pride. Your father, the scribe, forged your identity to hide you from the rogues that hunted your mother's bloodline. He buried the true queen of the valleys in plain sight. He touched her cheek. You carry the blood of the first kings, Genevieve. Your claim to the territories is older and stronger than mine. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the stone corridor outside. Silas was on his feet in a microsecond, his broadsword drawn. The guttural snarls of werewolves, tearing into each other, vibrated through the heavy oak door. The clash of steel rang out, followed by a wet, sickening thud. The door burst open. Standing there, covered in blood, was Cailan. He had gone completely rogue. Stripped of his alpha title and his pride, the dark magic of a broken mind had taken over. He held a silver-laced dagger, a forbidden weapon, dripping with the blood of one of Silas's guards. Behind him stood Corwin and a dozen loyalists who refused to bow to the king's decree. If I cannot have the southern armies, Cailan hissed, his eyes crazed, darting between Silas and Genevieve, then the king will not have a queen. I will end the Talbot bloodline tonight. He had been listening at the door. He knew her secret. Silas didn't even bother to speak. He let out a roar that shook the dust from the rafters, his body rapidly expanding, bones cracking and reshaping as he shifted into his lichen form, a monstrous, 10-foot-tall beast of midnight fur and muscle. Cailan lunged, but he was a dying ember throwing himself into a hurricane. Silas caught Cailan's armed hand in mid-air. With a sickening snap, the king broke the rogue's wrist, forcing him to drop the silver dagger. In the same fluid, brutal motion, Silas backhanded Corwin, sending the beta crashing through the stone balcony doors and out into the freezing blizzard below. The remaining loyalists faltered, staring in absolute terror at the Alpha King's true form. Silas placed a massive clawed foot on Cailan's chest, pinning the broken man to the stone floor. He looked back at Genevieve. He didn't execute him. He waited. Genevieve stood up. The timid scribe who had accepted a public rejection 3 days ago was dead. The ancient royal blood of Lady Eleanor Talbot and the Beaufort kings surged through her veins, amplified by the golden, roaring mate bond of the Alpha King. She walked forward, her chin raised, her eyes glowing with a newfound piercing silver light. She looked down at the man who had humiliated her. "You rejected a scribe, Kaelin," Genevieve said, her voice echoing with the dual, terrifying timbre of a true lunar queen. "But you raised a weapon against your sovereign. The punishment for treason is death. But death is too quick for a coward." She looked up at the trembling loyalists in the doorway. "Take him to the northern wastes," she commanded, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "Abandon him in the snow with no pack, no title, and no name. Let the winter claim him." The loyalists immediately dropped to their knees, bowing to their new queen, before dragging the screaming, begging Kaelin out of the chamber. Silence returned to the room. Silas shifted back to his human form, his chest heaving. He looked at Genevieve, his crimson eyes filled with a ferocious, undying devotion. He dropped to one knee, taking her ink-stained hand and pressing his lips to her knuckles. "My queen," Silas whispered, a vow that sealed their fates forever. The pack had gone silent when she was rejected. But tomorrow, when they rode for the high seat, the entire world would howl her name. Did Genevieve's revenge satisfy your craving for justice? If you loved watching the Alpha King destroy those who underestimated his fated mate, smash that like button and subscribe for more thrilling werewolf romance audio dramas. Share this video with your pack and drop a comment below telling us what you'd do if an alpha rejected you. Stay wild, and we'll see you in the next story.